Hi, everybody. Welcome to week one of PA 8566 Intergovernmental Management. This is my week one lecture. And what you're going to see, for those of you who haven't had me in an online class before, each week I will record a lecture, a PowerPoint lecture, and post it as a video on my YouTube channel. But also, in addition, I also post the PowerPoint slides without narration on the Canvas website. So they're both posted there on the Canvas website. So you can watch the PowerPoint with my narration and my comments, or you can just view the slides and dwell on one or more slides for a bit if you want to do that. So expect this during most weeks of the summer term. So this week, week one, I just want to describe briefly the purposes of the course. I want to talk about the syllabus, and then I want to lay out a little bit about a general view of intergovernmental management. So here I list 6 purposes of this course. And keep these in mind as we go through the semester, because these do drive how I've organized the course. So first of all, I want us to explore the historical and constitutional background of intergovernmental relations and intergovernmental management within the context of how we organize in the United States, and talk about that a little bit in this lecture, but also in the next couple of weeks. And we'll also talk about how federalism works and how it's evolved over the past 230, 240 years. And then we're going to move on to understanding the impact of what is called fiscal federalism and how this has changed and continues to change, really, the intergovernmental landscape. And then we want to understand the issues confronting public managers who have to administer programs and operate within this environment, this landscape. And then finally, as a purpose of the course, I want to give each student the opportunity to specialize in one or more aspects of intergovernmental management or intergovernmental relations, and then allow you to explore a particular problem of interest in IGM, intergovernmental management, or IGR, intergovernmental relations. So let me move on from there and explain a little more about where we're going here. Okay, so this is summer, as you know, 12 weeks or 13 weeks really in the summer term. And so typically for comparative purposes, there's 17 weeks in a normal fall or spring semester. So we're cutting off about 4 weeks from that time. So obviously we're not going to focus on everything. So the first 2/3 of the course we're going to convene really as a large group. The last third of the course, for about 3 weeks, I'm going to devote it to specialties, and those are emergency management, healthcare, and cities and other local governments. So basically in each of those domains, really, there's a lot of intergovernmental management, a lot of intergovernmental collaboration, or possibly intergovernmental argumentation, and I want to allow you to explore that. So there's 4 units. That's how I break up this summer. And each is going to feature discussions, and there's going to be a wrap-up journal at the end of 3 of them, I think. Then the final project is an essay on what I call future challenges, and then you see in brackets there, of some intergovernmental relations or intergovernmental management areas. So what's that about? This is not a term paper. This is about a 5 to 8 page essay. So this is an essay that's informed by references. It's not an opinion piece, but it's not a full-blown research paper either. So what I'm asking you to write is an essay that is informed by sources from the course itself, and also sources that you reference on your own about a topic. And so generally, you're going to write an essay that says, here are the future challenges of a particular area. And so to you, that might be, state-city relations. It might be city-city relations, interlocal relations. It might be challenges of the ongoing relationship of the federal government and state and local governments in terms of or emergency management, but really it's up to you to pick an area that you want to write on. So you might want to start thinking about that now. And again, I limit this to essay form of 5 to 8 pages. And so the grading finally of the course is about 240 points. If you look at the My Grade section of Canvas, it's going to look like more. That's because I have some duplicative points for separate discussion boards that are going to occur in the specialization part. But the grade is going to be based on 240 points altogether. That's what each student can accumulate. So 90 points for discussion board, 75 for the journals. That's 3 of them at 25 each. And then 75 points for this final essay. So 240 points altogether. So I talked about this a little bit. That's just the layout of the weeks and how long each of the units is going to last. Weeks 1 through 3 is foundation. Then weeks 4 through 6, I talk about coercion, or you might want to call it fiscal federalism. Unit 3 is collaboration. That's just 2 weeks. And then challenges or specialties in weeks 9 through 11, 9, 10, and 11. And then in week 12, we're going to come back together as a group. I just want to present one thing on the future of intergovernmental management. And then in week 13, that is the final week of the course, there's no other class participation beyond turning in your essay. So that's the layout. Okay, so what is federalism? Because this word federalism lies at the heart of, I think, everything we're talking about here. And is there something exceptional about it? That's really a nod to the Krislov article that I have you read this week. You know, is there something exceptional about American exceptionalism, and is American exceptionalism all wrapped up in federalism? That's the question I want you to ponder a little bit. So the Constitution of the United States, you know, for among many other reasons, is really important. It's important in the United States, obviously. It's important in the history of the world because the United States really is the oldest kind of written, integral constitution for nations. And many other nations have now written their own constitution. And it didn't used to be that way, right? So the British Constitution is really a series of precedent laws and a lot of other documents written over hundreds of years. But the US Constitution really was a culmination of what I call the founding era. And so it establishes framework, right? So the two main elements of the framework of the Constitution, in my opinion, are separation of powers and federalism. Those two main things really are the supports for the whole structure. So separation of powers, as you know, means co-equal branches of government, right? The executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, which both divide and share power and authority over the operation of government. So to say the powers are separated is a little bit inaccurate because that makes it sound like there's a wall between the powers, but really the wall is permeable, and so the branches of government actually share power and authority over the operation of government. And so separation of powers really, because of the US Constitution, became a staple for all state constitutions and for many city constitutions. And so we look at that as an essential of American democracy. And so the second support of the framework is federalism. And really federalism just means that 2 or more established governmental entities, usually at the national and the provincial or what we call state level, simultaneously exercise power and authority over some geographic area, right? So you live in Nebraska or Iowa or somewhere, California, you are under the authority of at least 2 governments, coercive governments that can actually require you to do things. So you're under the authority of the state and probably a local government. So that's 2, and you're also under the authority of the national government. And so that's what we think of as federalism, right? But this debate over the division of power and the boundaries of power and authority in both of these key concepts, separation of powers and federalism, those things were really part of the original debate when the Constitution was written. And so we continue to debate over this past 240 years. Um, and we, even today, right? We still continue to debate the relative power of the legislative versus the power of the president. We continue to debate the power of the state legislature versus the governor. We continue to debate the power of the city council versus the mayor, for example. And we continue to debate the power of the states versus the federal government. And so the debate is ongoing and really isn't going to stop anytime soon. But that really is what establishes sort of this environment of intergovernmental relations that we live with today. And so federalism, well, this last bullet here, kind of the really most interesting part of federalism is that it completely ignores cities. It talks about the states, it talks about the national government. Let me move on from that to this next slide. So I say our intergovernmental relations are bigger than federalism. That's the issue, right? So look at the thing on the left. It says according to the U.S. Census, that little box there. According to the U.S. Census in 1790, that's 3 years after the Constitution was written. So the very first U.S. Census was made a couple years after the first government under the Constitution was formed. So we had about 3.9, almost 4 million people in the United States. But of those people, about 95% of the people in the United States lived in rural areas, and only about 200,000, so less than 5% of that population, of that nearly 4 million population, lived in what were called urban areas, and that was places over 2,500. Places over 2,500. There were only 24 of those places with over 2,500 persons in them. So most everybody was rural. In 2010, the last official census, there was about 308, almost 309 million people in the United States. Of those, about 59.5 were rural, and about 249, almost 250 people were urban, that is in places over 2,500. Now, you might not think of 2,500 as being an urban place, but that is what is considered, that's the low line of an urban place. But really, I said there were about 24 places with over 2,500 people in 1790, but in 2010 there were 24 places in the United States, 24 cities with between 500,000 and 1 million people, and there are about 6 to 8 over 1 million people in the United States. So we only have about 19 or 20% of our population is rural now, compared to 95% of our population in 1787 when the Constitution was written, or 1790 a couple years later. And so that might explain why the founders, the writers of the Constitution, really weren't thinking much of, what happens in the cities. Maybe they weren't contemplating that we would become as urbanized as we have. And certainly with technology, transportation technology and communication technology as it was in 1787, it would be reasonable to expect that most people weren't going to settle in cities. But the point is, IGM and IGR are bigger than federalism because we don't just have the national government and state governments. We have one national government. We have about 50 state governments. And we also have territorial governments. This chart, which I took from the internet, but is really fairly accurate. It's copyrighted there. You can see by Pearson Education, but the data comes from the Census of Governments. It's other governments in the United States. So counties, municipalities, townships or towns, school districts, and special districts. So special districts are in a lot of states. And in Nebraska, we have natural resource districts, we have sanitary and improvement districts, In some states, there are library districts, there are sewer districts, there are rural water districts. We have those in Nebraska too. There are weed districts, believe that or not. We have weed control boards in some rural counties. And so what distinguishes all those 89,000 entities that you can see at the bottom as governments, right? Because this isn't what people are talking about in popular discourse when they say the government did something, or the government wants me to do this, or the government wants me to do that. So there's two things about most of those entities that are listed on there, and these are really important. Most of those entities, the governing boards, or the governance in general of those boards, derive their positions through election. So we know we vote for the president and senators and members of the House. And we also vote for the governor and members of the state legislature and city council and school board members. But some of these other things that you don't even think of, the persons actually obtain their office through election. So the people in the Platte River Natural Resources districts in plural, there are several of them in Nebraska, were all elected. The people that serve on the weed board of some counties, they're all elected. So that's the one distinguishing characteristic. The second is, and this is important, is that each of these governments is authorized by law to levy taxes. Now, the amount of taxes they can levy and the type of taxes they can levy is probably limited by the state legislature, right? In many of these cases, the type of tax that the school district or the special district levies is property tax. That is true in Nebraska. The school districts in Nebraska get their revenue from property taxes, and we're going through a big debate right now in the legislature between several members of the legislature and between the governor on property tax relief. And really, that affects not just the state level, but it affects the school district level as well, because school districts in Nebraska are heavily supported by local property taxes. And so there are many proposals to use some sales tax to help offset any property tax relief. But so those are just really two important characteristics of some entity that can call itself a government, is that the governance is probably elected, and they have the ability to levy taxes on people who live within that jurisdiction. So I'm just throwing this one out here, and really I'm not going to go very far with this. Is a quote from John Rohr. John Rohr wrote a lot of books about the public administration. This book is from his book called To Run a Constitution, so he's actually playing off Woodrow Wilson's words. And he's talking about the legitimacy of the administrative state. So here's Rohr's contention. Rohr's contention is not that administration is a fourth branch of government, but his contention is that administration really has a constitutional status because of separation of powers. And so public administration really answers not just to the executive, but also to the Congress and to the courts. And it helps maintain the constitutional balance of power. And so the job of administration is the same job broadly that the executive, the legislative, and the judicial have, and that is support of individual rights in the United States. And so we have this argument about whether public administration is a fourth branch of government. It is not in the Constitution. However, it is an important and real aspect of government, and it plays into the whole setting of intergovernmental management. This is a great quote. Take the time to read it. I'm not going to read it word for word, but it's also a really interesting book, albeit 30 years old. Okay, so why should you care about this? Well, this is from Meek and Thurmeyer, another text that I'm not having you read, but here's why you should care about this. The field of intergovernmental relations has evolved rapidly in the last decade. And the context of the problems, last sentence there, and issues facing American governments increasingly demands responses in both vertical, that would be, from the local up to the federal, and horizontal dimensions, that is across jurisdictions, most prominently in emergency management and environmental issues. So those are actually two of the areas that really we do see a lot of intergovernmental management, right? But here's what I say about what Meek and Thurmeyer had to say there. I say there's a complex web of elected and appointed officials, along with career civil servants and contractors, who interface in a network of interlocking relationships, agreements, funding mechanisms, shared programs, shared governance, all to affect governmental actions, right? So we say the government does something, it delivers some good or some service. But very often, it is not just a single entity of government that is doing the delivery. It is several entities, several layers of government that might be delivering the good or service, and the good or service itself might not be directly delivered by government. It might be delivered even through the for-profit sector or through a voucher or something like that. So we do have a complex web that constitutes what we call intergovernmental management. Well, so I think it's fair to say that we've always worried about, the relationship between the national government and the state governments. We've always worried about federalism. So, like I said, separation of powers on the one hand and federalism on the other are really the foundations of our Constitution. And so that's been an ongoing argument. However, I guess I would caveat that by saying that really we probably didn't worry about it as much. We we probably practiced what is called dual federalism. I think we're going to talk about that more in coming weeks. During the first century and a half of the existence of the United States, but it became clear that with the New Deal, and then even later around the mid 1960s, that the federal government started granting or giving more aid to the states. And so when money is involved, I think it's fair to say that we would pay attention more to this relationship. When the relationship is weaved with money, I think that the relationship then becomes something of interest to more people. And so this chart really talks about how federal money really is a big part of state budgets now, and particularly since 1965 and the innovation of Medicare, health programs and funding from the federal government have become really a very large part of state budgets. And up to the point where now most states, about a third of the budget is from the federal government. And so I'm not going to dwell on it, but this chart, I have a link there, and it's from some Pew Research. And basically look at the headline. Federal funds provide nearly $1 and $3 of state revenue. So this is a great little piece from Pew that you should take the time. You have to do it on the PowerPoint version of the presentation, but this provides you a lot of background on how intertwined federal funding and state funding are. Okay, so traditionally, we think of federalism using different models. And these are from an author named D.L. Wright, a scholar, D.L. Wright. He spent his entire academic career, scholarly career, studying intergovernmental relations and federalism. And so he suggested three models, right? The coordinate model, the overlapping model, and the inclusive model. And these all had to do with the relationship between national, state, and local governments. And again, there's more than that, but simplistically, we think of three, right? So the coordinate model means that the national government and the state governments are distinct from one another. So that is, they practice dual federalism and dual sovereignty, if you will, but that the local governments are subordinate to the state governments. And so in this model, they're independent, and there's autonomy, but they do coordinate with each other a lot. In the overlapping model, the one in the middle, what you see here is more of an idea of bargaining. So we have three levels of government, right, in this kind of Venn-looking diagram, the national, state, and local governments. And in the middle, they meet with some overlapping responsibilities. And so what happens is they bargain for who is going to do what to whom, and who is going to serve what clients, and who is going to tax in particular ways, and who is going to fund the others, and who is going to spend another level's money. So it's a bargaining relationship. And the third is really a dependent model, and it's a hierarchical model. So in this model, which a lot of people sort of think federalism is, we think the local government takes orders from the state government takes orders from the national government, but we know that really it's not strictly a hierarchy. We know it's not strictly just coordination. We know it's not strictly overlapping. All of these have things to like about them. I sort of think the overlapping model is closer to reality, but again, all of these models can be used to describe the relationship between levels of government in the United States. So I wanted in this lecture to wrap up with this. I wanted to give some examples of how can we exemplify this these examples of shared policy making, finance, and administration. And that quote comes from the Nathan reading. So I have 4 examples here: military, K12 education, housing, and highways. We're going to have a lot more during the semester, a lot more. The military. Interestingly, the military is actually one of the few areas of intergovernmental management that is actually codified in the Constitution. Because when the Constitution was written, one of the greatest fears of the anti-federalists, as well as the federalists, the anti-federalists opposed the Constitution, the federalists advocated for its adoption, but in both cases there was this fear based on their own history as English subjects of a standing army. So really the founders didn't want a big army. They didn't want a big military. But how did they mitigate that? Well, so they came up with this idea of there was a professional military of an indeterminate size. That was, Congress would say how big the military should be. So originally there was an army and there was a navy. That's in the Constitution. Congress dictated the size. Congress dictated the rules for that military. And then there were state militias. Later, in the 1900s, these became known as National Guard forces. So Congress actually writes the rules for both. That's in the Constitution. And the command and control of these forces, of the National Army and the National Navy, is by the president. And then when the militias were activated, called into service by Congress, then the president was the commander-in-chief of those militia forces as well. And so we see in today's environment that command and control of the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps is through the Department of Defense. Congress still says how big those forces are going to be. Congress still funds them. And the National Guard is under the control of every governor, right? Depending on the current status and depending on the situation. And so really we have a situation of dual command and control. And so this idea of National Guard and Reserve Forces actually allow the Department of Defense to keep full-time personnel strength lower than it might have to be otherwise, based on the stated needs and the stated strategy. So in 2018, for example, there was about 1.3 million active duty members in all 4 services, all 5 services. But there were about 450,000 in the National Guard and another 366,000 in the reserves. So what you take from that is that, nearly half of the forces, not quite half, but about 40% of the total force is National Guard and Reserve. And a good chunk of that is in the National Guard forces that belong to the states sometimes. But here's how that works. The DoD really foots almost the entire bill for National Guard, around 85% of Guard forces. So it pays all the paychecks. It pays for medical and retirement of all those people that are in uniform in the National Guard. The DoD owns all the equipment and assigns the military missions. So you see aircraft flying that say United States Air Force on them. They might be part of the Nebraska National Guard, but they belong to the United States Air Force. The governor can and does use National Guard forces for in-state missions. So we just had these historic floods in Nebraska and in Iowa. And so National Guard troops were called up to help with various missions. And so some of the funding for that comes from the state specific. The federal government may reimburse the states at some future time, but a lot of that money did come from the state. And so what can we say about the effectiveness of this intergovernmental relationship if we were going to judge it? And in my opinion, this actually happens to be one of the long-standing relationships between states and the federal government, and it's evolved certainly, and it hasn't been without conflict, but because it's one of the long-standing relationships, it probably works fairly well vis-a-vis other relationships, other intergovernmental relationships. Then there's K12 education. So, how is K12 education? How does it work? And I chose to focus on funding in this one. So K12 education funding is divided between levels of government, but really it's mostly weighted towards state and local sources. So this was 2016 from the census. There's about $671 billion spent on K12 education. Only about 54 or 55 billion of that came from the federal government. 318 billion came from all the states, and nearly that amount, about 299 or 300 billion, came from localities. That's what I was talking about earlier. So we see here that funding, if we're just simply looking at funding, we see that localities, that include school districts, really have a very heavy share of the responsibility for funding K-12 education. And so people often talk about K-12 education and the supposed attempts by the federal government to take over K-12 education, but if all we're doing is following the money, then there's not much federal influence. But we can point to other things like national standards imposed, for example, in the form of testing. So the No Child Left Behind Act, which imposed national level testing of all students in order for schools to maintain their funding from the federal government. And the federal government does pay for many important items like the school lunch program. States are responsible really for a bulk of the funding, and as well as organizing the districts and setting performance standards, for example, high school graduation standards in the state. But localities are also responsible for some of those things. So localities are also responsible for funding and organizing their districts and hiring their teachers. And so we see a lot of overlap. And so how would we judge the effectiveness of this intergovernmental relationship? This is an old one as well, but I think a lot of people would say this relationship seems to be a little more fraught for a lot of different reasons. And this is one that we'll explore later on, but it's an interesting relationship. And then there's housing. So when I say housing, I'm talking about two subjects here. One is just how do people buy houses? If you want to buy a house and you want to get a mortgage loan, unless you pay for it in cash, which you probably won't, but if you want to get a mortgage loan, chances are that mortgage loan is going to be backed by the federal government. The federal government is heavily involved in guaranteeing federal loans, either through FHA, through the agencies called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, or the VA. And this is according to this link I have here, the ProPublica report. It's very interesting that the federal government is deeply involved in the economy of selling houses and buying houses. Mortgage loans are by commercial banks, right? We know that. But in many of those banks probably wouldn't lend the money if those loans weren't guaranteed. And the industry itself is operated by this network of banks, title companies, realtors, lawyers. We know that, right? But that network, would it exist without the involvement of the federal government? And so you can kind of take that argument both ways, right? People could say, well, why doesn't the federal government just extricate itself from the market altogether and maybe the market would find more of an equilibrium. And I think I wouldn't argue with that. And others would say, well, the problem with that is that a lot of people wouldn't be able to get mortgage loans because the banks simply wouldn't lend to them for a variety of reasons, some of which are illegal and discriminatory. So that's one side of housing. The other side of housing is what we call low-income housing, right? So that's all through the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Department. So we know about public housing and the transition to what we call Section 8 or rent subsidies. And so most of that is strictly funded by HUD. But the administration of that program is through about 2,900 local housing agencies. There's about 3,000 counties in the United States, by the way. So there are housing agencies at the county level, at the city level. In Omaha, there's an Omaha Housing Authority. There's also a Douglas County Housing Authority. And so there are housing authorities that actually oversee these programs on behalf of the federal government, and local governments actually are involved in these housing authorities. So, for example, the city of Omaha appoints some board members of OHA. Highways. I wanted to talk about highways a little bit. There's about 4.1 million miles of road in the United States. I get this from the Federal Highway Administration. That's about 8.8 million lane miles if you're counting multiple lane roads. The federal government isn't responsible for most of those roads. The federal government really only owns about just 150,000 miles of road, right? And only about 1 million miles of road is really eligible for federal highway funding aid, right? So that would include things like the interstate highway system. But the part of the highways that the federal government does provide some aid for carries around 85% of all the highway travel. So some of the most congested highways in the United States really are eligible for federal highway funding, along with the interstate highways and the U.S. highways. So the federal government on those roads, on that 1 million miles of road, pays about 40% of the bill for construction and maintenance of those roadways. And the states end up paying about 60%. And how do we pay for all that? So at both the federal government and state government levels, we have gasoline taxes, right? That is the basis of our highway funding for most places in the United States. Well, so is that a viable source of revenue going into the future when there are electric cars? If I have an electric car, I never buy a drop of gasoline, but I do drive on the roads. As we move into the electric vehicle market, is that going to be a continued source of revenue? And how do local governments maintain their own roads? So that 8.8 million lane miles of road in the United States isn't all highways. Some of it's streets. So how does Omaha fund its pothole repair program every spring? That's a really important question, because Omaha isn't the only city in the United States with potholes. So how do local governments maintain their roads, quite apart from state and local funding? And so if we had to judge this relationship, how would we judge it? And I think that just in general, I think we're all aware that our infrastructure, our road infrastructure in the United States, is not in the best shape. And possibly part of the reason is because we have a difficult time really sorting through both the funding requirements and the funding mechanisms that are needed for highways. And so, again, from the Nathan text, if we're talking about policy making, finance, and administration being shared by levels of government, here's some things we have to think about, and this is going to translate throughout the whole course. One is it helps to understand the issue at hand. I mean, what are we really talking about? Some issues are under the purview of only one level of government or one agency, and so those are fairly simple to understand, right? So Social Security checks for old age and disability when the person turns 65 plus and files for Social Security, once they meet the qualifications and are vetted, they're going to get a check every month from Social Security Administration. Nobody from the state level government, nobody from the local level government is really going to help administer that. That's strictly administered by the federal government, right? Some programs are under the purview only of a local government, and it helps to understand that. Many issues, though, do share policy, finance, and administration, and I talked about the example of housing authorities. Not all relationships are hierarchical, as in between the city, state, and the federal government. Many are lateral. Many of the issues we're going to talk about in intergovernmental relations have to do with lateral relationships between cities in a region, for example. And some share collaboration with both for-profits and nonprofits. Those are in the collaboration mix. So that's kind of the overview for this week. There is a discussion question this week that has to do with the Krislov article. It's right there. There's a discussion question on that. There's also an intro discussion. So there's 2 discussions this week. I'd like to ask you to participate in both. Please do take time to read the syllabus, and please do understand the layout of the Canvas site. Participate in those 2 discussions, and if you have questions, please don't hesitate to email me there. Thanks very much.